People often only see the facade of success, but behind it there is a lot of pain, disappointment, and darkness. The shocking, unfiltered stories of rock stars not neatly packaged. I hope you can face the truth here in this memoir. One day, a teenage boy burst into the store with a gun. He pointed the gun at the clerk and demanded money. Moments later, the boy ran out of the store. He pulled out the crumpled bills he had shoved in his pocket, counting and grinning. He was thrilled that stealing money could be so effortless. His name was Charles. Charles was a high school student who committed armed robbery. He would abruptly stop passing cars. Charles would approach the driver's seat and point his gun, intimidating the frightened driver to give up their car. He would speed down the road, thrilled, but his excitement was short-lived, as approaching sirens made Charles jittery. The cops chased him down and busted him, sending Charles to juvie. 4 years later, after leaving juvie, Charles soon got married. To make ends meet, he worked at a car factory as a janitor and as a barber. In his spare time, Charles loved playing guitar. He would gig at various clubs in St. Louis for extra cash. Charles wished he could just play guitar for a living, but he was just another no-name guitarist, earning petty cash. One day, the saxophonist for a group called the Johnny Johnson Trio suddenly collapsed from a stroke, leaving them desperately needing a new member on short notice. The group's leader, Johnny Johnson, looked for a guitarist to fill in, but with a gig on New Year's Eve night, he couldn't find anyone available. Johnny learned that a guitarist named Charles could step in that night. When Johnny met with Charles, he introduced himself and asked his name. Charles replied that his name was Chuck Berry. His real name was Charles Edward Anderson Berry. People called him Chuck Berry for short. That night, the Johnny Johnson Trio and Chuck Berry took the stage. The audience went wild for Chuck's vocals and incredible showmanship. Chuck was hired on the spot as their permanent guitarist. Performing with the trio as Chuck Berry, he played blues, ballads, and country. Chuck Berry quickly picked up on the latest fad. He realized that mashing up country rhythms with blues was the cool new thing. In 1955, the Johnny Johnson Trio traveled to Chicago, where blues musician Muddy Waters hooked them up with Chess Records. As Chuck Berry pondered what blues songs to cut, the Chess Records president made a surprising suggestion: record some country tunes instead. Chuck had already absorbed various country and blues songs through performing. He came up with a song based on the white country tune Ida Red, calling it Maybelline. And Maybelline went on to sell over 1 million copies and hit #1 on the R&B charts. This made Chuck the first black musician to play white music. As Chuck's popularity skyrocketed, he signed a solo deal with Chess, while the other members became his backup band. When Chuck first held his record, he noticed another name besides his own listed as the songwriter: radio DJ Alan Freed. Back then, it was common for record companies to pay DJs under the table to promote their artists. Crediting Freed was essentially a payoff, granting him 25% of the song's royalties for airplay. With the writer credit, Freed played Maybelline extensively, making it a nationwide rock and roll hit. Chuck later reclaimed the rights in court. By the late 1950s, Chuck Berry had several hit songs and frequently appeared in movies, becoming a huge star. He also owned his own nightclub. Chuck was riding high on his success. But one day, Chuck was busted for relations with a 14-year-old girl and did 2.5 years in prison for taking her across state lines. In 1963, after being released, Chuck figured people had forgotten him, but he got another chance. Thanks to the British invasion bands like the Beatles and Rolling Stones, who idolized Chuck, covering his songs helped relaunch his career, especially when the Beach Boys' 1963 #1 hit Surfin' USA blatantly copied the melody of Chuck's Sweet Little 16, putting Chuck back in the spotlight. Though Chuck scored a few more hits, he lacked the intensity of his early years. His erratic on-stage behavior and sulky mood, performing without rehearsing with pickup bands, and being difficult about contracts earned him a reputation as an eccentric, lackluster performer. By 1970, Chuck was relegated to a washed-up nostalgia act, playing with terrible backup bands, often using out-of-tune guitars and pissing off crowds, eroding his fame. Afterwards, his only #1 Billboard single was the 1972 song, My Ding-a-Ling. In 1979, Chuck served 4 months for tax evasion, taking only cash payments and not paying taxes. In 1986, despite his spotty career, Chuck was nominated when the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame began, reminding him that he was still alive. But his antics continued. In 1987, Chuck was sued for assaulting a woman in a hotel who suffered lacerations needing 50 stitches in her mouth, 2 broken teeth, and facial bruising. He pled guilty to harassment charges, paying a $250 fine. In 1990, Chuck was sued by several women for secretly installing cameras in the bathroom of his restaurant. Chuck claimed it was to catch employees stealing money. Then one day, police found tapes at Chuck's house of him having relations with teenage girls, along with marijuana. While child abuse charges were dismissed, Chuck pled guilty only to marijuana possession, getting 6 months probation. Later, a video surfaced of Chuck filming a woman urinating and another woman defecating on him. In 2000, Johnny Johnson claimed he had co-written over 50 songs with Chuck, but the suit was dismissed as too much time had passed. Chuck, who caused much trouble and scandal, was now old, nearing 90. In 2017, at age 90, Chuck announced to the media he would release his first album in 4 years. But on March 18th that year, he passed away. The album was released posthumously, with his children participating in the recording, and was dedicated to his wife. Chuck Berry. His musical legacy was obvious. He pioneered rock and roll music. But whether he was a good man remains in question. Looking at his string of actions, he may have been evil. Certainly some of what he did deserves condemnation. Does success only come to bad people? Or does success turn people bad? Chuck Berry lived an inscrutable life. Here in this memoir, we tried to unpack his complicated life.